Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic. Let's do it. What's your creepiest story? Real or not? Come on, freak us out. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. 100% true story. Don't know if it'll scare you, but it remains one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. When I was 17, I was at a party at a friend's house. We grew up in a small town with lots of woods, no streetlights, houses far apart from one another, etc. There was virtually no crime in this town, except for the abduction of a 5th grader about a decade earlier. Her remains were found behind a restaurant in the town years later, but the case was never solved. My friends and I had been drinking all night, so I didn't want to drive home. That happened to me frequently enough that I always had a sleeping bag in the trunk of my car. Around 2 a.m., I ran out to get the sleeping bag. It was pouring out with thunder and lightning. I could barely see my car, which was parked just beyond the driveway, on the side of the road. When I got to it, I popped the trunk and dug around for my sleeping bag. There was a flash of lightning, and the street lit up for a second. That's when I noticed a middle-aged man standing a few feet from me. He didn't move, he just stood completely still. I can't remember what I said. For all I know, I probably just gasped. However, I remember exactly what he said. "I just love thunder and lightning storms, don't you?" Not hello, or even, "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." I slammed my trunk shut, sleeping bag still in there, and sprinted back to the house. I immediately told everyone what happened. Of course, they were drunk, and they thought I was making it up. But I forced them to look out the window toward the driveway. After 30 seconds, lightning struck, and the street lit up again. Sure enough, there was the man walking down the street in the opposite direction from the house. One of my friends told me this story in high school, and he swears up and down that it is true. One night, this guy was driving back home from his girlfriend's house when a large dog ran out in front of his car. My friend had no time to swerve and hit the dog dead on. Being an animal lover, he jumps out of the car to see if the dog is all right or not. But before he can come around to the front, he sees the dog get up on 2 legs and run off into the field next to him. Anytime I drive by a field now, my blood pressure spikes. My friend and I were driving out in the country. This is a small hick town down south. To put some context in this, all the dumb high school kids would go drive on the back field roads and smoke pot. Just farming roads, mostly dirt or gravel for various fields. Pretty views and no cops. Anyways, it was late at night and we were going around a tight curve. My friend was going a bit fast and dicking around with his hitter or something. A dog, a black lab, runs into the middle of the road. The car hits head on. It goes under the car between the wheels. My friend slams on the brakes, opens his door, and gets out. I get out on the passageway and look under the car. I don't see any dogs. My friend, in the most panicked and scared voice I ever heard, says my name. I get up and look over the car. There's a man, a filthy man, looks like a bum or a hobo, standing between my friend and the car door. I say, "Hello, we accidentally hit a dog." He looks over at me and gives a hard effing stare. I mean, really freaked out. The man doesn't say anything and starts walking. My friend gets into the car. I jump into the car, close the door, and lock it. My friend is super freaked out and starts driving. We're both like, F, 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 what the F, man? My heart is racing. We find the quickest way back to the main road. My friend is really shaken up and pulls out on the highway. He's driving like a crazy person. My heart is pounding. It's about ready to rip from my chest. Red and blues. Headlights flash from our rear. Cop car pulls out from the dark behind us. We pull over. The cop says, "What's the matter, boys? You were driving a bit irradiated back there. You boys been drinking?" The cop is flashing his flashlight around the car and in our eyes and making us more nervous. My friend was, "No, sir. We hit a dog back there and just a bit freaked out." The cop says, "You mean that dog?" while shining the flashlight in the back seat. We both look in the back seat. A dead black lab is laid there. My chest can no longer hold my pounding heart. I grew up in a small country town in Australia. Country towns have secrets. When someone smashes their car into a tree, the police and paper don't always report the alcohol involved. Even as the nurses talk about how the dead guy reeked of whiskey. Bad things happen, and people sometimes overlook it as it continues. So, house with dad, mom, and 3 kids. People suspect bad things. You can see the father in the supermarket and tell something is wrong. You see the kids with bruises. One day there was a fire in their house when they were out. The fire brigade put it out, and the police end up there to investigate. locks, on the outside of the children's bedroom doors, a room with a collection of pornography and photos of other stuff. Nothing but the house fire is reported. The family moved away from the town soon after. No one says anything because they don't want the town to become known as the home of an artist, pedophile, pornographer, or whatever else is going on in there. The covered-up event is bad, but what really creeps me out is the ongoing conspiracy of silence that pervades the entire town. I never really put much stock into the concept of ghosts or the supernatural in general. My mother's an alcoholic and a self-described psychic, so it was pretty easy to take my personal experience with her and apply it to the whole spectrum. I'd roll my eyes so violently at the mere mention of spirits, you'd think they were about to roll out of my head. About 10 years ago, my friend and I were walking through this park on the way back to his house. It was a shortcut, which made it appealing when you had to go home at a certain time, and along the water, which made it rather scenic. We fancied ourselves teenage philosophers, and we would generally have these long-winded conversations about how we were going to change the world. For what it's worth, we didn't even notice when it changed us. For the purpose of illustration, I need to describe the park. It was a long, curving path off of a longer one, the Galloping Goose Trail, that circled a small inlet of water along the gorge. Walking up the hill, the lights at the side of the trail stopped just before you got into the woods proper, and there was one last one along the hill that stood like a beacon, a lighthouse. Beyond that, the path continued through a wooded area, crested up a hill, and went down again. At one point in the path, you could see this wooded area crested up a hill and went down again. You could see this broken down house peering through the trees, but that was about it. You were never actually all that far away from houses and stores. It just felt like you were. When the sun went down, the park was rather foreboding and incredibly dark. As we were walking up, we did this all the time. The last light along the trail flickered and died. I found this odd, but not especially noteworthy. It certainly didn't come up in conversation. We walked into the dark, and we were coming down the hill on the other side when there was this noise. It was impossibly loud, and it had movement to it. Now, I don't know about any of you, but in my position, my rational mind immediately leapt to explain the noise. I discerned it was a helicopter, at first merely flying low to the ground. But as it got closer, and the sound could be heard with more clarity, my heart sank. And then it was all around us, a thunderous roar. I looked up, and the trees were still silhouetted against the evening sky. I heard voices, not 10, but hundreds, thousands. It was a single, distorted sound consisted of speaking, whispering, and screaming. I couldn't make out individual words, but I knew what I heard, and it was awful. The sound faded and continued away from us. We looked at each other, we didn't say a word, and we turned on our heels and walked back. We weren't running, but there was an undeniable briskness to our pace. When we got back to the main road, I lost my shit. I couldn't explain it, and it terrified me too. It terrified me because I couldn't punch it in the face. I realized how foolish that must sound, but that feeling of utter helplessness was horrible. I asked him if he had heard it, and he just nodded his head. We looked into it. It figured we'd be big bloody detectives, make ourselves feel better or something. It turns out that the only real calamity of our little town ever had a bridge collapse, and the bodies were dragged up on the shores we were walking through that night. The house that I mentioned, the one that stood alone, foreboding and derelict in a row of otherwise normal houses, we checked it out. And the feeling of dread I got from the place was enough to make our visit brief. There was a shitload of lumber there, just sitting there in piles, rotting. We found out that there had been an abandoned renovation attempt through the city archives, but any history on the house itself was really hard to come by. We found out later that it wasn't where it was originally built. It was originally built on the other side of town. There was a fire listed in the records, and then it was moved. I don't know why, but I stayed the F out of the park afterwards. Mostly. I was out with my girlfriend a few months later. The initial shock of the incident had worn off, and I was telling her with all the gusto and enthusiasm of an uncle at a campfire when we started making that trek up the hill. I told her we'd be okay. I still don't know why I said this. I said we'd be okay so long as the light didn't burn out. As if on cue, it did. She started tugging at my arm in the opposite direction and declared that we were leaving. I stood there slack-jawed and just looked at the light. And then I started seeing things. Tricks of the light, maybe? I looked down and the shadows. The shadows of the trees seemed to be circling around us. I'd never seen anything like that before or since. I never went into that park again after dark. This happened when I was about 5 or 6, and it stayed clear in my mind since then. Never did I figure out if it was real or just a really vivid night terror. There I was, reading my Sesame Street book, all cozy in my bunk bed with my siblings and parents fast asleep, leaving me and my imagination awake to entertain ourselves. I was a little nerdy bookworm who would read when I couldn't sleep at night, which was nearly every night, but this particular night something felt off. As I lay there reading with only the moonlight streaming in from my bedroom window as my flashlight, I realized how cold the room had gotten. In an attempt to stave off the night chill, I set my book down next to me and pulled my quilt up closer to my chin. The book slid down and fell into the crack between the wall and my bed. So instinctively, I reached down to retrieve my lost treasure. As I was pulling the book up, however, I felt a slight tug on the end of it, like this would keep me from my Grover. I pulled back. It pulled back. I pulled again, and it pulled back stronger. A flash of a hand could be seen, then even in the darkness, and my eyes grew wide. All of a sudden, the child in me reeled with fear, as the knowledge of all those terrible stories might possibly be true. Now would I try to get my book back, or face certain death? I'll admit, I was one risk-loving kid. This was nothing to be fooled with, though, so I let it go. The book hit the hardwood floor with a thud, and I heard scraping under my bed like nails on a chalkboard. As stiff as a board, I didn't move an inch except to dart my eyes to my sleeping sister in bed 10 feet away. All I heard was the soft snore from the unmoving form, as well as from my dreaming younger brother above. The next morning, thinking it had just been a figment of my lovely imagination, I go under the bed to get back my cherished possession, only to find it nowhere to be found. All that was left was a deep scratch in the floor next to where the book should have been. Needless to say, I read in my well-lit closet with the door shut and a mound of blankets for years after. The woods you described sounded very similar to ones that I constantly hike, jog, and run in. And I've run in them at 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. with no lights. And there's like all types of haunted stories about these woods. I've never seen anything, but the way you described it, there's some things that are eerie for sure. So nothing like that though. One night I was having this really odd dream. It was one of those ridiculously long dreams that seems like it lasts for years while you're asleep. This one lasted a whole lifetime. I watched a woman live her life. I watched as she was a child, as she grew up. I watched her go through school and college. I watched her social life evolve. I watched her romance, her marriage, and her pregnancy. I watched her live her midlife, raise her children, and then grow old. It was a pretty normal life. I didn't see any trauma. I didn't remember how she died, but the moment it was over, I woke up. I had to go to the bathroom really bad. I stumbled out of bed probably 4 a.m. in a most asleep daze and went to the bathroom. As I sat and peed, I saw her face looking at me through the window. There she was, old, wrinkled, wide-eyed, and gaping, with the most horrible, scornful face looking at me. It didn't faze me at the time. I got up and walked back to bed and fell right asleep. I didn't realize until the next morning the horrifying thing I had seen. I married my college sweetheart right after we graduated. After about a year, it wasn't going well, and it seemed like it would be best for me to move out. My brother, who's a few years older than me, lived on the other side of town where he has a fairly large house. He's actually planning to move to another city and stay there in rented accommodations pretty much all the time. He agreed that I can stay in the house until I get myself sorted out, or until he sells the house, whichever comes first. His house was actually kind of run down. He had been planning to fix it up, but was so busy with his job that he never really got that much done. I had plenty of time on my hands at evenings and weekends, so I volunteered to do some fixing and decorating for him. Over a few months, I repainted all the rooms, fixed all the wooden floors, and even retiled both the bathroom, put in a new toilet and shower, etc. My brother paid for all the materials. He gave me a prepaid debit card, but I did all the labor for free, of course. The last room that I was doing was a bedroom. It had a built-in wardrobe cupboard, kind of built into the wall. I decided to paint the inside of the cupboard as well as the room itself, since the cupboard is dirty yellow inside with lots of black marks on the walls. I used the last of the white paint to paint the inside and left the doors open for it to dry. That was my Friday night, and I went to bed. The next day was a Saturday, and the last thing to do was paint the walls of the room, which include a dark red lower half and a cream upper half. There's a rail between them, and it didn't look as horrible as it sounds. I went to get the red paint from the corridor, where I had been using it to touch up a spot that I had missed. I then went back to the corridor to get the red paint tray with the roller and brush in it. I tripped as I entered the room. The tray and roller fell on the floor, which fortunately was covered. But the brush went into the cupboard and hit the wall. It left a mark that looked like an elongated S, with a long line going straight down underneath it. Now I was pissed, because I would have to repaint the inside of the cupboard, at least a couple of coats to cover the dark red, which means I will have to go out and buy more white paint as well. I picked up my brush and started to write shit, using the elongated S for the initial letter. The H, however, came out looking more like an A, so I write Satan instead. There was still a long line of paint running vertically under the S, so I made that more vertical stroke of a K and wrote kill. I thought nothing of it, and then got on with painting the rest of the room. I spent several hours painting the entire room, and by the time I was finished, it was dark and late, and I was aching and really hungry. I decided to go downstairs to get some food and then go to sleep. As I was leaving the room, Satan Kill caught my eye, and for some reason I decided to write the words in orders you to after Satan, making the message Satan orders you to kill. It didn't seem important, as I'm planning to paint over it anyway. First thing Sunday morning, I went out and bought a tub of white paint. When I got back, I painted over Satan orders you to kill, but you can still read it through the white paint. I then started on the second coat in the room proper. When I finished that room, I redid the white roller over Satan orders you to kill in the cupboard again, but you can still read it. For the next week, every morning before I leave for work and when I get back from working in the evening, I rollered another layer of white paint over Satan orders you to kill. I was convinced that it was still faintly visible. The next weekend, my brother came over, so I showed him the cupboard and asked him if he could see any message written inside it. He said that he couldn't, but I was still convinced that it was faintly visible. I told myself that that is my mind playing tricks with me, and that I must take his word for it. Nevertheless, just to be sure, I did add a few more layers of paint over the next few days. During this time, there are periodically people who come with the realtor to look at the house. My brother was, after all, trying to sell it. I do particularly remember one family, mother, father, and teenage boy, who spent ages looking over the house one Saturday. I think, not sure, if this is the same family that reappears later in the story. I soon moved out and moved to another town. I got a new job and rented my own place. My brother eventually sold the house. I met a new girl, etc. At Christmas, my brother invited me and my girl over to his large apartment in a major city. We went to visit. When we're talking, he tells me that he's so glad that he's rid of that house, since it always gave him the creeps. Ask me if it ever gave me the creeps. It didn't. The killer revelation: the family who bought the house, the teenage son, killed his parents and hid their bodies in a cupboard. An elderly man was sitting alone on a dark path. He wasn't certain of which direction to go, and he'd forgotten both where he was traveling to and who he was with. He'd sat down for a moment to rest his weary legs, and suddenly looked up to see an elderly woman before him. She grinned toothlessly, and with a cackle spoke. "Now, your third wish. What will it be? Third wish?" The man was baffled. How can it be a third wish if I haven't had a first and second wish? You've had two wishes already, the hag said, but your second wish was for me to return everything to the way it was before you'd made your first wish. That's why you remember nothing, because everything is the way it was before you made any wishes, she cackled at the poor man. So it is that you have one wish left? All right, he said. I don't believe this, but there's no harm in wishing. I wish to know who I am. Funny, said the old woman as she granted his wish and disappeared forever. That was your first wish.